Richard Hartwell stared at his phone, reading the email for the 5th time. His hands were actually shaking. After 30 years of conducting small orchestras in regional theaters, after countless performances that only his wife and a handful of music enthusiasts attended, he'd finally gotten the call. The National Symphony Orchestra wanted him to conduct their New Year's Eve concert. Not just any concert, the one that would be broadcast live on national television. He sat down heavily in his study chair, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This wasn't just a career opportunity. This was the opportunity. The kind that conductors dream about their entire lives. The kind that changes everything. His wife Catherine found him there 20 minutes later, still staring at the screen. She knew something big had happened, just by looking at his face. When he told her, she actually screamed with joy, something she hadn't done since their wedding day 23 years ago. They held each other in that small study, both of them crying happy tears. Both of them understanding that their lives were about to change forever. The concert was scheduled for 3 months away. 3 months to prepare for the most important night of his professional life. Richard threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him. He woke up at 5 in the morning to study the scores. He spent hours listening to recordings of the greatest conductors in history, analyzing their every movement, their every interpretation. He made notes in the margins of his sheet music until the pages were covered in his cramped handwriting. The program would feature some of the most beloved pieces in classical music. They'd start with something light and celebratory, move through some emotional movements, and end with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The ninth, the piece that every conductor dreams of performing perfectly. The piece that could make or break a reputation. Richard rehearsed his movements in front of the mirror in his bedroom. Catherine would sometimes watch him from the doorway, smiling at how seriously he took every gesture. His conducting wasn't just about keeping time. It was about telling a story with his hands, about drawing emotion from 70 musicians and weaving it into something beautiful. Every flick of his wrist mattered. Every expression on his face would influence how the violinists played, how the cellists felt the music. His twin sons, Danny and Tommy, thought their dad had gone a bit crazy. They were 8 years old, and while they loved their father, they couldn't quite understand why he was so obsessed with waving a stick around. They were used to their dad being the conductor at the local community orchestra, but this seemed different. This had turned him into someone who barely noticed when they asked him questions at dinner. Someone who stayed up until midnight making notes about tempo changes. Catherine tried to explain it to them. "Boys, do you remember when you wanted to win that soccer tournament so badly? And you practiced every single day for weeks?" They nodded. "Well, this is like that for your dad. Except it's the biggest tournament of his entire life." The boys understood a little better after that. They started tiptoeing around the house when their dad was practicing. They drew pictures of him conducting and taped them to his study door for encouragement. Tommy even asked if he could watch one of Dad's rehearsals, which made Richard so happy he almost cried again. As the weeks passed, Richard's preparation became more intense. He traveled to the city every week to rehearse with the actual orchestra. These weren't just any musicians. These were the best of the best, people who'd played at Carnegie Hall, people who'd performed for presidents and royalty, and they were going to follow his direction. Him. Richard Hartwell from a small town in Pennsylvania, whose own music teacher had once told him he'd never make it as a professional musician. The first rehearsal was terrifying. Richard walked into that massive concert hall, saw all those talented musicians looking at him, and his mind went completely blank for about 10 seconds. But then he raised his baton, and something magical happened. The music started, and suddenly he wasn't nervous anymore. He was home. He was doing what he was born to do. The orchestra members were professional and talented, but they were also human. Some of them were skeptical at first. Who was this guy from nowhere? Why hadn't they gotten a more famous conductor? But Richard won them over, one rehearsal at a time. He knew the music inside and out. He had ideas about interpretation that made even the veteran musicians nod with approval. He treated everyone with respect, from the first chair violinist to the percussionist in the back. By the third rehearsal, the concertmaster, a violinist named Patricia who'd been performing for 40 years, pulled him aside. "You know what?" she said. "I wasn't sure about you at first, but you've got something special. This is going to be a great concert." Richard went home that night feeling like he was walking on air. Catherine noticed the difference immediately. The nervous energy had transformed into confident excitement. He was ready. He was actually ready. The television network sent a production crew to meet with him. They explained how the broadcast would work. There would be cameras everywhere, close-ups of his face, wide shots of the orchestra, angles that would capture every moment. Millions of people would be watching. They'd see him conduct live, with no second chances. No ability to stop and restart if something went wrong. "No pressure," one of the cameramen joked, and everyone laughed. But Richard felt his stomach twist a little. Millions of people. He tried not to think about it too much. The family would be there, of course. Catherine and the boys would sit in a special section reserved for family members just off to the side of the stage, close enough that Richard could glance over and see them if he needed a boost of confidence. The boys were excited about missing school the next day and staying up late to watch their dad on TV. They'd told all their friends. Their teachers had even said they'd watch the broadcast. The final week before the concert, Richard barely slept. Not because he was unprepared, but because his mind wouldn't stop running through every detail. What if he tripped walking onto the stage? What if his baton slipped from his hand? What if he forgot a cue? These were irrational fears, he knew. He'd conducted hundreds of performances without any of these things happening, but this was different. This mattered in a way nothing else ever had. Catherine held him the night before the concert. "You're going to be amazing," she whispered. "I've watched you prepare for 3 months. Nobody could be more ready than you are. Those musicians respect you. The music is in your blood. Tomorrow night, you're going to show the whole country what I've known for 23 years. You're brilliant." Richard held on to those words. He repeated them to himself as he finally drifted off to sleep. He was ready. He was prepared. Everything was going to be perfect. He had no idea that his 8-year-old sons, lying awake in their shared bedroom down the hall, were having a very different kind of conversation. A conversation about a funny idea that had popped into Danny's head. A conversation that would change everything. Danny couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual for him to stay awake long after bedtime, his mind spinning with ideas and thoughts that wouldn't quiet down. His brother Tommy was already snoring softly in the bed across the room. But Danny's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. He kept thinking about the concert, about how serious everyone was being, about how their dad had been so stressed and worried for months, and then an idea hit him. The kind of idea that made him smile in the darkness. What if they did something to make their dad laugh? Something to break all that tension? "Tommy," he whispered loudly. "Tommy, wake up." Tommy groaned and rolled over. "What?" "I'm sleeping. I have an idea." For the concert, it got Tommy's attention. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Tommy was usually the careful one, the one who thought things through, but he also trusted his brother completely. They were twins, and they'd been partners in everything since birth. Danny explained his plan in excited whispers. Their dad always kept his conducting baton in a special case. What if they switched it with something else? Something funny? Just for a moment, just to see his face when he realized it. They'd switch it back right away, of course. It would be like a good luck joke, something to make him smile before the big performance. Tommy wasn't so sure. Mom said we have to be on our absolute best behavior. She said this is really, really important. "I know," Danny said. "But that's exactly why Dad needs to laugh. He's been so nervous. Remember last week when he jumped because the phone rang? He needs to relax." Tommy thought about it. Their dad had been pretty stressed lately. Maybe Danny was right. Maybe a little joke would help. What would we switch it with? Danny's eyes lit up. "Remember those glow sticks from Halloween? The ones that light up when you bend them? We could use one of those. It's the same size as his baton." Tommy started to laugh, then covered his mouth. The image was pretty funny. Their serious dad, in his fancy tuxedo, picking up a glowing toy instead of his professional baton. But how would we even do it? His baton is in his case, and he keeps that with him. "I saw it backstage last week when we visited," Danny said. "Remember? Dad had to talk to the stage manager, and he left his stuff on a table. There's a whole room back there with equipment and stuff. I bet we could sneak back there before the concert starts. This was sounding more complicated and risky than Tommy had expected. I don't know, Danny. What if we get caught? What if something goes wrong? Nothing will go wrong, Danny insisted. We'll go backstage right before the concert, when everyone's busy. We'll switch the batons. Dad will pick it up, see it's a glow stick, and laugh. Then we'll immediately give him the real one. 5 seconds, that's all. Just enough to make him smile and relax before he goes on stage. The boys lay in the dark, both thinking about the plan. Tommy wanted to say no. He wanted to be the responsible one and remind Danny that their mom had been very clear about behaving. But he also remembered how tired their dad looked, how worried he'd been. And it would be pretty funny. "Okay," Tommy finally whispered. "But we have to be super careful. And we switch it back right away. Promise?" "Promise," Danny said, grinning in the darkness. The next few days, the boys prepared for their plan like it was a spy mission. Danny found the glow sticks in the Halloween decoration box in the garage. He tested one to make sure it still worked, bending it until the chemicals inside mixed, and it glowed bright green. It was almost the same length as their dad's baton. Perfect. Tommy's job was to figure out the timing. They'd been to the concert hall twice now for rehearsals, and he'd paid attention to where everything was. The backstage area was usually busy, but there were moments when people stepped away. If they were quick and quiet, they could slip in and out without anyone noticing. The boys didn't think about what could actually go wrong. They were 8 years old, and in their minds, this was a harmless prank. They'd seen pranks on TV shows and YouTube videos. Everyone always laughed. The person getting pranked might be surprised at first, but then they'd laugh too. That's how pranks worked, right? Catherine noticed something was up. She'd been a mother long enough to know when her boys were plotting something. They kept whispering to each other and then stopping suddenly when she came into the room. They were being too well behaved, which was always a warning sign. "What are you two up to?" she asked one evening, standing in their doorway with her arms crossed. "Nothing," they said together, which was exactly what guilty children always say. "I mean it, boys. The concert is in 2 days. Your father is under enormous pressure. I need you to promise me you'll behave perfectly. No running around, no being loud, no causing any trouble whatsoever." "We promise, Mom," Tommy said, and he meant it. They weren't trying to cause trouble. They were trying to help. "We'll be really good," Danny added. "We won't mess anything up." Catherine studied them for a long moment, then sighed. "I'm trusting you. This night is incredibly important for your father. Do you understand?" They nodded solemnly. And they did understand. They just didn't understand how badly their plan could go wrong. The day before the concert, they did a final check. Danny had the glow stick hidden in his jacket pocket. Tommy had memorized the layout of the backstage area. They'd practiced being quick and quiet, timing how fast they could move from one room to another. They were ready. That evening at dinner, their dad was unusually quiet. He pushed his food around his plate, barely eating. Catherine reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're going to be wonderful," she said. Richard managed a small smile. "I just keep thinking about everything that could go wrong." "Nothing's going to go wrong," she said firmly. "You've prepared more than anyone could possibly prepare. The orchestra loves you. The music is perfect. Tomorrow night, everyone is going to see what an incredible conductor you are." Danny and Tommy exchanged glances across the table. Their dad was so worried. Their plan was definitely a good idea. He needed to laugh and relax before the performance. They were doing the right thing. New Year's Eve arrived with cold, bright sunshine. The family spent the day quietly at home. Richard went over his notes one final time. Catherine made his favorite lunch, though he barely ate it. The boys tried to watch TV but couldn't focus. They kept thinking about that evening, about their secret plan. At 4 o'clock, they started getting ready. Richard put on his tuxedo, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror multiple times. Catherine wore a beautiful dark blue dress. The boys had matching suits that made them look older than 8. Tommy kept touching his jacket pocket nervously, making sure the glow stick was still there. The drive to the concert hall was quiet. Richard was too nervous to talk. Catherine held his hand. The boys sat in the back seat, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. They were really going to do this. When they arrived, the concert hall was already buzzing with activity. Television crews were everywhere, running cables and positioning cameras. Orchestra members were arriving, carrying their instrument cases. Security guards checked everyone's credentials. It was organized chaos. Richard had to go straight to his dressing room to prepare. Catherine and the boys were supposed to go directly to their seats, but Danny had other plans. "Mom, can we go to the bathroom first?" he asked. "Make it quick," she said. "I want you in your seats before things get too hectic." The boys headed toward the bathrooms, but as soon as their mother was out of sight, they changed direction. They'd memorized the route to the backstage area. Left at the main corridor, right at the second hallway, through the door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Their hearts hammered as they pushed through that door. The backstage area was just as busy as the front of the house. People were rushing around with clipboards and headsets. No one paid attention to two boys in suits who looked like they knew where they were going. They found the equipment room where their dad's things were stored. The baton case sat on a table, right where Danny had seen it before. He reached for it with shaking hands. This was it. This was really happening. "Hurry," Tommy whispered, watching the door nervously. Someone could come in any second. Danny opened the case and pulled out the professional conducting baton. It was beautiful, perfectly balanced, the kind of tool a master musician uses. He set it carefully on the table and pulled out the glow stick from his pocket. For just a second, he hesitated. Something felt wrong, but he'd promised Tommy they'd do this together. He bent the glow stick until it cracked and began to glow bright green. Then he placed it carefully in the case where the baton had been. The real baton went into his jacket pocket. They'd give it back to their dad in just a few minutes, as soon as they saw his face when he discovered the switch. "Done," Danny whispered. "Let's go." They slipped back out of the room and made their way back to the main corridor. No one had seen them. No one suspected anything. They found their mother and took their seats, both of them buzzing with nervous energy. In 1 hour, the concert would begin. In 1 hour, their harmless prank would turn into a nightmare that neither of them had seen coming. The concert hall looked like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over everything. Red velvet seats stretched in perfect rows, filling up quickly with well-dressed audience members. Television cameras were positioned at strategic points, their red lights blinking as they prepared for the live broadcast. Catherine sat in the family section with Danny and Tommy on either side of her. She felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the stage where her husband would soon stand. After all his years of hard work, all the small performances in half-empty theaters, he was finally getting his moment. She was so proud she could barely breathe. The boys sat stiffly in their seats, the glow stick plan feeling heavier with every passing minute. The concert hall was so formal, so serious. Important-looking people filled the seats around them. A television producer with a headset walked past, speaking urgently into a microphone. This wasn't like the small community concerts they'd attended before. This was huge. Tommy leaned close to his brother. "Danny," he whispered. "I don't think this is a good idea anymore." "It's fine," Danny whispered back, but his voice shook a little. "We'll give him the real baton as soon as he sees the glow stick. It'll be okay." But Tommy's stomach hurt. He reached into his pocket where the real baton sat, feeling its smooth surface. What if they couldn't get to their dad in time? What if something went wrong? He opened his mouth to tell Danny they should stop this. But before he could speak, the lights began to dim. The audience fell silent. A voice came over the speakers announcing that the broadcast would begin in 2 minutes. Catherine reached over and squeezed both boys' hands. "Your father's about to make history," she whispered. Danny's mouth went dry. Tommy felt like he might throw up. Backstage, Richard stood in front of a mirror, straightening his bow tie for the 100th time. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd done everything he could to prepare. The music was memorized. The orchestra was ready. Millions of people were about to watch him conduct. This was it. A stage manager knocked on his door. 5 minutes, maestro. Richard took a deep breath. He picked up his baton case without opening it and headed toward the stage entrance. The case felt right in his hand, familiar and comfortable. He'd carried it to hundreds of performances. He didn't think to check inside. The orchestra members were already in their seats, instruments at the ready. They'd warmed up earlier, and now they sat in focused silence, waiting for their conductor. The television director counted down in his headset. 30 seconds to air. All cameras ready, and we're live in 5, 4, 3, 2. The red lights on all the cameras turned solid. Millions of people across the country were now watching. The announcer's voice filled living rooms from coast to coast. Good evening, and welcome to our New Year's Eve concert with the National Symphony Orchestra. Tonight, we're proud to present Maestro Richard Hartwell, conducting a spectacular program of classical favorites. Richard heard his cue. This was the moment. He walked onto that stage with his head high, his baton case in his left hand. The audience erupted in applause. The sound washed over him like a wave, and for a second all his nervousness disappeared. This was where he belonged. He walked to the podium, acknowledging the orchestra members with a slight bow. They nodded back, ready to follow his lead. He set down his baton case and opened it, reaching inside without looking, his mind already on the first piece they would perform. His fingers closed around something plastic and cylindrical. It felt wrong immediately. Too light, too smooth. He pulled it out and stared at it in complete confusion. In his hand was a bright green glow stick, pulsing with chemical light. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Richard's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. This made no sense. This couldn't be happening. He stood there in front of the orchestra, in front of the cameras, in front of millions of viewers, holding a children's toy and feeling like he'd stepped into a nightmare. The cameras zoomed in automatically, capturing his bewildered expression in perfect high definition. The close-up showed every detail of his face, the confusion, the dawning horror as he realized something had gone terribly wrong. In the family section, Danny felt his heart drop into his stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Dad was supposed to laugh, and then they'd run up and give him the real baton. But they couldn't run up there now. The concert had already started. The cameras were rolling. Everyone was watching. "Mom," Tommy whispered urgently, his voice cracking with panic. "Mom, we have to." But before he could finish, Danny stood up. "Dad!" he yelled, his 8-year-old voice cutting through the formal silence of the concert hall. "Dad, wait!" The microphones picked it up. His voice echoed through the speakers and broadcast into millions of homes. Catherine grabbed Danny's arm and pulled him back down, her face white with shock. "What are you doing?" she hissed. The orchestra members looked at each other in confusion. The television director was frantically speaking into his headset. "Stay on him, camera 3. Get the kid too. I don't know what this is." Richard's face had gone from confused to bright red. He was still holding the glow stick, and now everyone in the concert hall was starting to murmur. He could hear nervous laughter from somewhere in the back. On stage, the concertmaster, Patricia, looked at him with concern in her eyes. His mind raced. Where was his real baton? How did this happen? He looked toward his family, and that's when he saw his sons' faces. Danny was crying. Tommy was pulling something out of his pocket. In that instant, Richard understood exactly what had happened. His boys had done this. As a prank, as a joke. And now he was standing in front of the nation's most prestigious orchestra, broadcast live to millions of people holding a glow stick instead of a conducting baton. A camera operator, thinking quickly, panned to show the audience. Some people were covering their mouths in shock. Others had started to laugh. In living rooms across America, social media was already exploding. Screenshots were being taken. The moment was being captured and shared at lightning speed. Richard forced himself to move. He set down the glow stick, his hands shaking now, and dropped to his knees to look under the podium. Maybe his real baton had fallen. Maybe there was a logical explanation. But there was nothing there except dust and a music stand. Maestro, Patricia said quietly from her seat in the first violin section. Do you need a moment? What he needed was to disappear. What he needed was for this to not be happening. But it was happening, and millions of people were watching. And he had to do something. The stage manager appeared from the wings, hurrying over with a concerned expression. Richard waved him away, trying to maintain some dignity, even though he could feel it slipping away like water through his fingers. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and tried to think, in the control booth. The television director was making rapid decisions. Keep rolling, he told his crew. This is either going to be the best television of the year or the worst. Either way, we're not cutting away. Catherine had both boys by their arms now, her face a mixture of fury and horror. She'd warned them. She'd made them promise. And they'd done something that had just humiliated their father on national television. She couldn't even form words. She just held them there, all three of them watching as Richard tried to figure out what to do next. Richard made a decision. He turned to the audience, his face still burning with embarrassment, and spoke into the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected beginning. It appears there's been a small mix-up with my equipment. His voice came out steadier than he felt. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Others looked sympathetic. The television cameras captured every second of it. The stage manager returned with a backup baton from the equipment closet. It wasn't Richard's personal one, the one he'd used for 30 years, the one that felt like an extension of his arm. But it would have to do. He took it, tested its weight, and tried to gather his composure. But the damage was done. The moment was ruined. Instead of starting the concert with dignity and authority, he'd started it as the conductor who held up a glow stick on national television. Instead of people talking about his interpretation of Beethoven, they'd be talking about this disaster. He raised the borrowed baton, avoiding eye contact with the orchestra members who looked as uncomfortable as he felt, gave the downbeat, and the music began. The orchestra played beautifully because they were professionals. But Richard conducted. Mechanically, his confidence shattered, his mind filled with the image of that glowing green toy in his hand. Every camera angle captured his performance. Every note was broadcast live. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Richard knew that this moment, this horrible, embarrassing moment, would follow him for the rest of his life, in the family section. Danny and Tommy cried silently, understanding for the first time that some pranks aren't funny at all. The concert continued, but nothing felt right. Richard moved through each piece like he was watching himself from outside his body. His technique was flawless because muscle memory took over when his brain couldn't, but there was no joy in it, no passion. The orchestra played beautifully, but he knew they could feel his distraction. Music is honest that way. It reveals everything. When they reached Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, piece he'd dreamed of conducting perfectly, Richard felt a deep sadness settle over him. He gave the cues, shaped the phrases, guided the musicians through one of humanity's greatest compositions. But instead of losing himself in the music the way he'd imagined, all he could think about was that glowing green stick. That moment of confusion and humiliation captured by a dozen cameras. The audience gave them a standing ovation when the final note faded. People clapped and cheered because the music had been exceptional, but Richard barely heard it. He bowed mechanically, shook hands with the concertmaster, and left the stage as quickly as protocol allowed. In his dressing room, he sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. Someone knocked, probably the production staff wanting to talk about what had happened, but he didn't answer. He just sat there in his expensive tuxedo, feeling like the biggest failure in the world. Meanwhile, Catherine had taken the boys to a quiet corner of the lobby. Their families passed by, offering congratulations on the performance, completely unaware of what had caused that strange beginning. Catherine waited until they were alone before she spoke. "Tell me everything, right now." The boys confessed through tears. The whole plan came spilling out. How they'd thought it would make their dad laugh and relax. How they'd snuck backstage and switched the batons. How they'd planned to give back. The real one immediately, but everything had gone wrong so fast. Catherine listened, her anger building with every word. But underneath the anger was something worse. Disappointment. deep, crushing disappointment that her sons had done something so thoughtless after she'd specifically told them how important this night was. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked quietly, which was somehow scarier than if she'd yelled. "Your father worked for 30 years for this opportunity. 30 years. You turned the most important moment of his career into a joke." "We didn't mean to," Danny sobbed. "I just wanted him to laugh." "We're sorry," Tommy added, his face wet with tears. "I didn't know it would be so bad." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to control her emotions. She was angry at them, yes. But she was also angry at herself for not watching them more carefully. She'd known they were up to something. She should have pushed harder to find out what. "We're going home," she said. "Your father needs space right now, and honestly, I can't even look at you two without wanting to scream. We'll deal with this tomorrow." The drive home was silent except for the boys' quiet crying in the back seat. Catherine's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She kept thinking about Richard's face on that stage, the confusion and embarrassment. Her heart broke for him. Richard came home 3 hours later. He'd stayed at the concert hall, avoiding the after-party, avoiding everyone. When he walked through the door, still in his tuxedo, Catherine went to him immediately. She wrapped her arms around him, and he finally let himself break down. "It's all anyone will remember," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not the music. Not the performance, just that stupid glow stick." "The boys told me everything," Catherine said. "They're devastated. They understand what they did wrong." Richard pulled away. "I don't want to talk to them. Not right now. Maybe not for a long time." That hurt worse than anything. The boys had been waiting up despite the late hour, hoping to apologize directly. But when they heard their father say he didn't want to talk to them, they went to their room without a word. The next morning, Richard woke up to discover that the concert had indeed gone viral. But not in any way he'd hoped. His phone was flooded with notifications. News websites had articles with headlines like "Conductor's Glowing Mistake" and "New Year's Eve." "Concert starts with unexpected light show." Social media was even worse. There were memes, jokes, video clips edited to add funny sound effects. Someone had created a GIF of his confused face, holding the glow stick. It was being shared thousands of times with captions like, "When you realize it's Monday," and "Me trying to adult." Late-night talk shows had picked up the story.
Our one host
Did an entire segment about it, joking that it was the perfect metaphor for how everyone felt about their New Year's resolutions. Richard sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, watching his dignity be torn apart by strangers who thought it was hilarious. Some comments were kind, saying that mistakes happen and he'd conducted beautifully after that rough start. But those were drowned out by the jokes and the laughter. "Glow stick gate," one headline called it. That's what his career-defining moment had become. A punchline. Catherine found him there an hour later, still in his pajamas, still staring at his phone. She gently took it from his hands. "Stop looking at that. It's not helping." "My career is over," he said flatly. "Who's going to hire me now? I'm the conductor who didn't even know what his baton looked like." "Richard, that's not true. You conducted a beautiful performance. Anyone who actually watched beyond the first minute knows that." But Richard couldn't hear her. He felt like he'd been carrying a precious vase for 30 years, something fragile and important, and then dropped it right at the finish line. All the preparation, all the perfect rehearsals, all the praise from the orchestra members, none of it mattered now. The boys stayed in their room most of that day. They'd heard their dad come home. They'd heard their parents talking in low, serious voices. The weight of what they'd done pressed down on them like a physical thing. This wasn't like the time they'd accidentally broken a lamp or tracked mud through the house. This was so much bigger. "I hate us," Danny finally said, lying on his bed and staring at the ceiling. "We ruined Dad's life." Tommy didn't argue. He felt the same way. They'd wanted to help, wanted to make their dad smile, and instead they'd destroyed everything. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" "I don't know," Danny whispered downstairs. Catherine tried to get Richard to eat something, but he had no appetite. He sat in his study, the same place where he'd first read the email about the concert opportunity 3 months ago. Everything had been so full of hope then. Now, it all felt like ashes. His phone rang. It was Patricia, the concertmaster from the orchestra. For a moment, he considered not answering, but she'd been kind to him during rehearsals, and he didn't want to be rude. "Richard," she said when he answered, "I wanted to check on you. Last night was unexpected." "That's one word for it," he said bitterly. "For what it's worth, I thought you handled it with remarkable grace, and your conducting was brilliant. We all thought so. Brilliant conducting that nobody will remember because they're too busy making jokes about glow sticks." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You know, in my 40 years of performing, I've learned something. The moments we think will define us rarely do. But how we respond to those moments, that's what people remember." Richard thanked her and hung up, but her words stayed with him. How he responded. What did that even mean in this situation? Days passed. Richard barely left the house. He didn't answer calls from friends or colleagues. He didn't check his email. He just existed in a fog of embarrassment and disappointment. Catherine worried about him, but didn't know how to help. The boys remained in their own prison of guilt, speaking only in whispers, moving through the house like ghosts. On the 4th day after the concert, something changed. The mail arrived with a stack of letters forwarded from the symphony. Richard almost threw them away without opening them, assuming they were more jokes or criticism. But Catherine convinced him to look at just one. The letter was from a woman in Ohio. She wrote that she'd never watched a classical music concert before, thought it was boring and stuffy. But she'd tuned in because of all the buzz on social media about the glow stick incident. She'd stayed to see what would happen next. She'd discovered that she actually loved classical music. She'd bought tickets to see her local orchestra the following month. Richard stared at the letter, not sure what to feel. He opened another. This one was from a teacher who said her elementary school students had been talking about the concert all week. They thought the beginning was funny, but then they'd asked questions about the music, about conducting, about how orchestras work. She'd never seen them so interested in classical music before. Another letter was from a teenager who wrote that classical music had always seemed too formal and serious for him, but seeing a real person make a real mistake and then conduct beautifully anyway had made it feel more accessible. More human. Richard read letter after letter, and slowly something shifted inside him. The story wasn't over. The ending hadn't been written yet. Maybe Patricia was right. Maybe how he responded to this moment mattered more than the moment itself. That evening, he finally knocked on the boys' bedroom door. They looked up with red, swollen eyes, and he could see how much they'd been suffering. His anger had faded over the past few days, replaced by a more complicated mixture of feelings. They were 8 years old. They'd made a terrible mistake, but they'd never meant to hurt him. "I'm ready to talk," he said quietly. Richard sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, while both boys sat cross-legged on the floor, looking up at him with anxious faces. The past few days had aged them somehow, looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. "I want to understand," Richard said carefully. "Help me understand why you did it." Danny took a shaky breath. "We're so stressed, Dad. For months, we heard you wake up in the middle of the night. We saw you forget to eat lunch because you were practicing. Mom said you were worried about everything that could go wrong. We just wanted you to laugh," Tommy added, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought if you saw the glow stick for just a second before the concert really started, it would make you smile. Then you wouldn't be so nervous. We're going to give you the real baton right away," Danny continued, tears starting again. "We had it in Tommy's pocket, but everything happened so fast. The lights went down, and you walked out, and we couldn't get to you. We didn't know it would be on TV right away. We didn't think. We ruined your life," Tommy finished, his voice breaking. "And we're so sorry." Richard felt his chest tighten, looking at his sons, seeing their genuine remorse and pain. He realized something he hadn't been able to see through his own embarrassment. They were children. Children who loved him and had tried to help in the most misguided way possible. "You didn't ruin my life," he said quietly. "You made a mistake, a big one. But you didn't ruin my life." "But everyone's making jokes," Danny said. "We saw them online before Mom took our tablets away. Everyone thinks you're stupid." "Not everyone," Richard said, thinking of the letters he'd been reading. "Some people think other things." He told them about the letters. It's about the woman who discovered classical music because of what happened. It's about the students asking their teacher questions about orchestras. about the teenager who decided that classical music was for real people, not just serious adults in fancy clothes. The boys listened, confusion replacing some of the guilt on their faces. "But you were so embarrassed," Tommy said. "You were so upset." "I was," Richard admitted. "I still am, honestly. I worked so hard for that moment, and it didn't go the way I'd dreamed. But I'm starting to realize that maybe it went a different way for a reason." Over the next week, more letters arrived. The symphony's phone lines were flooded with calls. And here's what surprised everyone, Richard, most of all. Ticket sales for the symphony's upcoming concerts had tripled. The website traffic had increased by 600%. People who'd never considered attending a classical music performance were suddenly interested. The music director called Richard for a meeting. Richard went expecting to be fired, or at the very least told that his conducting career was over. Instead, he was offered something completely unexpected. "We want to create a new concert series," the director explained. "Something called Family Night. Less formal, more accessible. We'll still play beautiful music, but we'll talk to the audience about it. Explain things. Make it welcoming for people who've never been to a symphony before. And you want me to conduct it?" Richard asked, surprised. "We want you to host it," the director said. "Conduct it, yes, but also talk to people. Be yourself." That moment on New Year's Eve, as mortifying as it was, showed people that conductors are human, that classical music doesn't have to be intimidating. Richard went home and thought about it for days. Part of him wanted to refuse. Part of him wanted to hide from the public eye forever. But another part, a growing part, was intrigued by the possibility. He talked to Catherine about it late one night. "What if I fail again?" he asked. "What if I'm just setting myself up for more embarrassment? What if you don't?" She countered. "What if this is actually an opportunity? You've always said that classical music should be for everyone, not just the wealthy elite. Maybe this is your chance to make that happen." 3 weeks after the New Year's Eve concert, something else unexpected happened. A video essay appeared on YouTube, analyzing the incident and its aftermath. A young music professor had created it, and it went viral in its own right. The video talked about elitism in classical music, about how the formal traditions that were meant to show respect for the music had instead created barriers that kept regular people away. It showed clips from the New Year's Eve concert, not to make fun of Richard, but to illustrate how one human moment had done more to democratize classical music than decades of outreach programs. "This conductor could have hidden," the professor said in the video. "He could have let embarrassment end his career. Instead, he's choosing to turn this moment into something meaningful. That's not just conducting. That's leadership." Richard watched the video 3 times, something shifting inside him with each viewing. Maybe this wasn't about his ego or his embarrassment. Maybe this was about something bigger. He accepted the symphony's offer. The first Family Night concert was scheduled for 2 months away. Richard threw himself into planning it with the same intensity he brought to the New Year's Eve concert. But this time, the energy felt different, lighter, more purposeful. He decided to open the concert by addressing what had happened. No hiding from it. No pretending it didn't occur. He'd tell the story, acknowledge the embarrassment, and then talk about what he'd learned from it. The boys were invited to attend, sitting in the front row this time instead of the family section. Richard had forgiven them completely by now. In fact, he'd come to see their mistake as an accidental gift. A painful, humiliating gift, but a gift nonetheless. On the night of the first Family Night concert, Richard stood on stage in front of an audience that looked completely different from the New Year's Eve crowd. There were families with young children, teenagers, people in jeans and casual clothes alongside the traditional concert-goers in formal wear. The concert hall was packed beyond capacity. "Good evening," Richard said into the microphone. "Before we begin, I want to talk about glow sticks." The audience laughed, and it was kind laughter. Knowing laughter, a few months ago, I had what I thought was the worst moment of my professional life. I was about to conduct the most important concert of my career, broadcast live to millions of people, and instead of my conducting baton, I pulled out a glow stick. He held up an actual glow stick, which got more laughs. My sons put it there as a prank. They thought it would make me laugh and relax. It didn't work out quite like they planned. The audience was completely engaged, leaning forward in their seats. But here's what I learned from that embarrassing moment. I'd spent so long trying to be perfect, trying to be the serious maestro who never made mistakes, that I'd forgotten something important. Music isn't about perfection. It's about connection. It's about emotion. It's about being human. He gestured to the orchestra behind him. These incredible musicians don't need me to be perfect. They need me to be present. They need me to help them tell stories through music. And you, our audience, you don't need us to be untouchable and formal. You need us to share something beautiful with you in a way that feels real. Richard saw Danny and Tommy in the front row, both of them sitting up straight, watching him with wide eyes. So tonight, we're going to make mistakes. Maybe a lot of them. Someone might play a wrong note. I might give a cue too early or too late, and that's okay, because we're going to make music together. And we're going to explain what we're doing. And we're going to make this feel like something you're a part of, not something you're watching from a distance. The concert that followed was unlike anything Richard had conducted before. Between pieces, he talked to the audience about what they'd just heard. He invited children to ask questions. He had orchestra members demonstrate their instruments. When a cellist played a wrong note during one piece, Richard stopped, smiled, and said, "See? We're human." And everyone laughed. By the end of the night, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pure joy. Not the satisfaction of a perfect performance, but the deeper joy of real connection. He looked out at the audience and saw people who'd been moved by the music, who'd learned something, who'd felt welcomed into a world they'd thought wasn't for them. After the concert, families lined up to thank him. The young music professor who'd made the video essay was there, asking for an interview. Local news crews wanted to cover the story of the conductor, who turned viral embarrassment into meaningful change. But the moment that mattered most came later. When the concert hall had emptied and Richard was packing up, Danny and Tommy ran up to him, and he knelt down so he could look them in the eyes. "Dad," Danny said. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. You were being yourself," Tommy added. "Not trying to be fancy or perfect, just being you." Richard pulled them both into a hug. "You know what? That glow stick might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop pretending I was something I wasn't. Helped me figure out what really matters." "So you're not mad anymore?" Danny asked hopefully. "I was never really mad at you," Richard said honestly. "I was mad at the situation. But that's over now. We're okay. Better than okay." Catherine joined them, wrapping her arms around all three of them. "I'm proud of you," she told Richard. "Not just for the concert, but for how you handled all of this. You took something awful and made it meaningful." Over the following months, the Family Night concert series became more popular than anyone had expected. Other symphonies across the country started similar programs. Richard was invited to speak at music education conferences about making classical music accessible. The video of the original glow stick incident was still out there, still being shared, but now when people talked about it, they talked about what came after one evening. Almost a year after the New Year's Eve concert, Richard sat in his study going through his old notes. He found the pages he'd marked up so carefully before that performance. Remembering how stressed he'd been, how worried about every detail, he smiled, thinking about how different he felt now. He still prepared carefully for concerts. He still took his work seriously, but he'd learned to hold it all more lightly. To remember that the goal wasn't perfection, but connection. Danny knocked on the door. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" "The glow stick thing?" Richard thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "That moment of standing on stage, confused and embarrassed, in front of millions of people, that was genuinely awful. But what came after? The chance to reach people who never would have listened to classical music otherwise. The opportunity to be myself, instead of trying to be some formal, perfect version of a conductor. I wouldn't trade that for anything, even though people still make jokes about it." "Even though," Richard confirmed, "because now when they make jokes, they're jokes about someone they feel connected to. They're not laughing at a stranger. They're laughing with someone they've come to know through the music." Danny nodded, processing this. "I'm still sorry we did it, though." I know you are, and I love that you're sorry. It means you learned something important about thinking before you act, about considering consequences. But I also love that you were trying to help me in your own weird way. You saw that I was stressed and you wanted me to laugh. That came from a good place, even if the execution was terrible. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, the evening was turning to night. Inside, everything felt settled in a way it hadn't before that chaotic New Year's Eve. "Hey, Dad," Danny said as he got up to leave. "Yeah. Next time you have a big concert, we promise to just wish you good luck like normal people." Richard laughed. "I appreciate that. But you know what? I'll always double-check my baton case anyway. Just to be safe."